Greetings to you, brothers and sisters. During this pandemic, the need for fellowship deepens. The pandemic COVID-19 has heightened the loneliness epidemic in South Africa and the world at large, raising awareness among congregation that the lonely among them might not be so obvious. On some level, someone in the church is feeling the pain of feeling disconnected. What will pastoral care look like in the coming months, in the coming years? This pandemic has exposed pastors and church leaders to new and unexpected pressure points in their ministries. Often I have felt alone and exhausted. Loneliness, however, as a phenomenon, is nothing new, nor is loneliness unheard of within the life of the congregation. COVID-19, however, has introduced countless life-altering adjustments for the church leaders and pastors. With the inability to perform so many of their responsibilities and passions, many pastors are experiencing deep levels of grief. There is no easy way out of the ditch of despair, but we can give each other some advice, which I hope will be helpful. Maybe first of all, we need to identify what pastors are grieving on. What are ways to healthily navigate pastoral grief during COVID-19? We can indeed share wisdom, share hope, and practical strategies to help church leaders navigate the complexities of grief during this global crisis. Allow me then to give a brief summary of each losses, and we've broken them down into 4 categories. We shall then seek to cover each session in the next video sessions, and I hope that they will be helpful to you. But the question is, what are some of the common losses that pastors and church leaders are experiencing? Here's the first one. I call it the Cascade effect. Carrying the losses for everyone in your church and in your community, and feeling the impact of each of those unique responses can be heavy. You have people facing everything from sadness of cancelled milestones like graduations and weddings, to the loneliness of the elder who live alone. On top of this, pastors aren't able to visit those who are hurting within their community. Caring for those in need is a major part of pastoral role that's currently a substantial loss pastors and church leaders are experiencing or facing. And this brings about a sense of loneliness. Therefore, we're going to deal with the loneliness in our first session. And the second loss pastors are experiencing is spiritual rhythms that have been interrupted. Weekly participation of worship in a local church is not possible at the moment, depending on what lockdown level we find ourselves in. And that shift happened so quickly that this intimate loss comes with so much shock. Pastors and church leaders thrive when worshiping together with their community every week, and that connection has been interrupted. What about preaching in live setting? Many church leaders spend a lot of time preparing to see their church community while sharing the word of God with them. Now that is not a reality for church leaders. In-person feedback is also something pastors are grieving the loss of. And the question is, how do we stay in touch with our church? How do we keep worshiping with our flock? And then on our third session, we will look at the loss, the potential shift in identity. Pastors may find themselves feeling the weight of once being an expert in their own space, to suddenly not having the answers to the uncertainty COVID-19 brings. They are also experiencing the weight of not being able to carry out some of their typical duties, such as weddings, funerals, and day-to-day care of their congregation. And the question is, how can you carry out your duties without risking yourself? And in our last session, we will look at everyday routines and stability. You see, brothers and sisters, the simple routine of knowing what you are going to do is now all uncertain. From the timeline of reopening church to the process of gathering again, it's challenging for church leaders to create routines and plans around such unknown factors. One moment we are in stage 1, another moment we are in stage 3, we are in stage 4, we are in stage 5. It's very unpredictable. And how do you plan? And the question is, what should be a pastor doing not to just occupy time, but to be fruitful? I hope when we cover all these sessions, this is going to be of great help to you. Let us get immediately into what we can talk about today. Today we're going to look at the first loss that pastors and church leaders are experiencing, the cascade effect, that carrying the losses for everyone in your church and in your community and feeling the impacts of each of those unique responses can be heavy. And one of the things that grieving brings is a sense of loneliness. Indeed, there's a lot of pastors who feel so much pressure by the fact of not being able to do anything, or even doing so much, or thinking about what to do. Being overwhelmed by such losses, the pastor finds himself lonely. Often I felt alone and exhausted. Pastors, what can we say to some of our fellow pastors? How are you dealing with the loneliness in your own ministries and in your own lives?
Heads, tails?
Yes, Pastor Johnston.
I think we need to recognize the reality that COVID has certainly thrown a curveball into pastoral ministry. I think what you're saying in terms of the cascade effect is true, and it's maybe exacerbated. But I don't think we need to recognize it as necessarily something new. I think that has been a reality in pastoral ministry for millennia, and there's certainly unique dynamics during a lockdown season. But I think even in terms of the framing of the question, my mind's jumping back to, for example, even if we go back to the Apostle Paul biblically, oftentimes he would have been alone in a prison cell, etc. He's pastoring from a distance, far removed from people. There were the instances where obviously in house arrest he could have people around him and so forth, but largely I think even Paul would have experienced loneliness back in the first century doing ministry. So it's nothing new. And I think there's certainly that would have borne, there are examples of that all the way through church history. I'm particularly struck even missionally of, if you look at the 16th, 17th, 18th century missionaries going into contexts where communication was very erratic and scant and slow. You get on a ship, you sail for 3 months, you send a letter back, it's almost a 9-month turnaround time kind of thing, and they're out there on their own. So I don't think we need to play the game that what we're seeing in terms of the COVID situation is new. I think those on the cold front of Christian ministry have always experienced that. And I think even within our own country, taking the Baptist Union as a case in point, even pre-lockdown, they're pastors in very remote context where there is no network, there is no fraternal, and so forth. They're out there on a limb to a large degree. If it's a town and that's the only church, there's no natural network. So I think we need to recognize that there's probably a bigger loneliness and disconnect at play that has been heightened through COVID and lockdown. But it's certainly not a new dynamic, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the need for connectedness and community is something, firstly, that God saw within humanity in the creation account, and He saw that we cannot live alone, but community is something that's deeply needed in our human experience. And so loneliness, if we're looking for a sort of a running definition, would result from the separation of community connectedness.
Okay.
And so, yes, and I think COVID-19 has brought that within many settings, and we've all felt that to a little or to a large extent, just being separated from the community of and the local church experience. But yet at the same time, I think we were all forced to, to restructure, to think up at the same time new ways of connecting, and praise God for media that enabled us not only at that macro level of the local church, but even within the one-on-one communication that we were able to have with each other as leaders or probably worship teams, coming together at that level. And so we saw the church, and I'm speaking out of my own experience as well, that the church, even though we were removed from that which would be considered normal community, but yet we were able to reorganize and at the same time find some sense of community and creating that sense of community as we journey through COVID-19.
So basically what pastors were saying is that loneliness has always been there to some degree, but COVID-19 has sort of like plunged us or unveiled the depthness of loneliness such that we experience new levels of loneliness. For example, if we were used to get to the fraternity meetings, we are no longer going to that weekly fraternity meetings where it was sort of like a fueling pump where you would go every week to get some encouragement, but now some of those things are not happening. But if we're going to try to bring it to some practical things that even though we've been feeling lonely, but right now we're being subjected to the realness of it, what are some of the things that we as pastors then should be doing so that we don't feel left alone or lonely, and at least we've got something that we can do even around these restrictions?
I think the reality is, as we look at ministry within our own country and maybe the subcontinent, is a recognition of the socio-economic disparities that exist, and I think to a large degree that may well be associated with some degree of geographical issue. So I'm going to answer that question in a very different way from somebody that's sitting in a rural church with a lack of means and a lack of technology and a lack of data and so forth. I think it's true to say that for many within the country doing ministry, in situations where we've had access to what Terrel's saying in terms of the communication and media and so forth, in many ways we haven't really missed a beat. We might not be able to physically gather. The network haven't met for coffee. The fraternity or fraternal hasn't met kind of once a month for the lunch or whatever the case might be. I haven't been able to get together with my usual buddies in ministry and share. But when midnight on the 26th of March happened and we moved into the 27th, I still had a phone, I still had WhatsApp, I could still SMS, could still email, and we all discovered Zoom and Teams and so forth. And to a large degree, while the face-to-face couldn't happen, I wasn't compromised in contact with another pastor or from a congregant. So the personal contact wasn't limited, it just changed. But we need to, I think, just accept the reality that for many in the country where those means weren't available, the existing isolation geographically might have just been heightened and exacerbated. So I think it's very different in in different contexts. Thoughts?
Yeah, in that reorganizing, and I think we were in a good way, stuck with our families.
For some.
For some. And at the same time, you know, that became sort of the foundation where we are able to confront loneliness and at the same time find that sense of community within the family and minister even from that perspective. So, for instance, within my context, our family would normally lead worship at our local church, and that's the worship team. And so what it did was it just moved ministry from there, from the local church building to the home, and we were still able to find some sense of connectedness. And I think even to a deeper level, as God started to work within the marriage and within the family, as we we're like was said, you know, forced now to reorganize and to or to do church in differently. And for me, that sense of community still prevailed, even though it was at around this little circle called the family. And so, and in a way, that prevented some of the loneliness that would creep in, where even within that little circle, there was a deepening of relationships, even before looking outward, you know, at the fraternals and the leaders within the family environment.
So basically, what also I'm getting, which I could also share my own experiences, is that it feels so lonely when suddenly all your duties are stripped from you and there's nothing that you can do. And if you've been very busy preaching, teaching, visiting, and suddenly you can't do that, that's I think part of the loneliness that we are also talking about. I met one pastor who said, we actually closed everything, and I don't know what to do. And I'm feeling like as if I don't have ministry at all. Right here in Joburg, in the city, where there is WhatsApp and everything, but I think the pressure of shutting down and everything even locked some of the pastors from even thinking of ideas. And the fact that maybe you are not connecting with other pastors, then you don't even get any idea of what to do. And I had to sit down with the pastor and share some of the things that we are doing, simple things that we are doing with WhatsApp, connecting with the church and connecting with some of my pastoral friends. And we may take for granted that actually every person is up with technology, even when some people around it have not seen the use of WhatsApp and continuously doing ministry, as you said, even at home, putting up songs together and then sending them to people. A pastor can still find himself busy doing something that is very constructive. One of the things that I've been doing was that every week, once I meet with some 4 pastors, senior pastors who are older than me, some have retired, and we play a game of golf. And by that I was connecting and growing and all that. For sure, in the first lockdown, we could not meet that. And I felt so lonely because that was my only source of connection. But when the rules were eased off, we continued meeting. But there's one thing that I like that some of those pastors kept on doing. They kept on checking on me through WhatsApp, and we kept on talking. And that made me felt that I am still with my gang. And when the rules were eased, we meet once a week. And it's not just about the sport, but it's about connecting. So I feel like I'm being taken care of by just doing something that is so simple. So apart from many other things that we could do, there could be simple things that pastors need to keep on doing in order to keep in touch either with other pastors or even within your community.
But Johann, I think you're putting your finger on something vital, and that is the value of existing relationships. I don't think lockdown was the time to actually discover them for the first time. And I think the guys that have effectively navigated this successfully had that network in place already, either in a formal fraternal or just clumps of ministry friendships. And I think as we're sitting now, we're not in hard lockdown, we're not in level 5, we're not in level 4, we're somewhere on level 3.8.32 or something, we're not quite sure, and we're not sure where it's going. But the reality is it's significantly eased. And I think maybe flowing from this conversation, if there is somebody listening who is experiencing loneliness now, the exhortation would be find men, women, friends, ministry partners, peers that you can develop relationships with, so that if we are thrust back into a hard lockdown, those relationships are already in place, and all that it does is it shifts to a digital space. You know, even pre-lockdown for a number of months, I was actually meeting with a guy who I would now regard as a friend out of the Afrikaanse Baptist Kerk, and we were meeting weekly for sermon review before we were preaching. In other words, we would actually meet probably 48 hours before a Sunday, review each other's material, bat around application points, and then we would mutually refine and actually go, and it was a helpful review before presentation. The point is, when lockdown happened, that just shifted it into an online space. But it went far beyond just the ministry refinement. There was the prayer, the support, the conversation. But the point is, it was already in place, and it just shifted into a virtual space. So I think my exhortation would be, if there's a sense of loneliness, while there's freedom to move and meet and have meals and play golf and have coffee, foster those relationships, that if the wheels fall off again, you're not scrambling around to look for the support.
Just following on what you're saying, Gavin, I think a classic example would be in the Elijah experience, you know, after the Mount Carmel experience, and witnessing what God had done, and then the 3 years of drought where he said no rain, and then he says, okay, rain is coming. And immediately after that, Jezebel, hearing that the 450 prophets of Baal have been slaughtered, and here she throws out a threat, and we find Elijah in a space now where there's a sense of loneliness. As he moves further, he moves with his servant, and then he abandons that one person sort of that could have been the lifeline for him, you know, humanly speaking. And he heads even deeper into the desert, and there is a pity party in the end that he throws, and in God answering him, giving him sort of the basic necessities first. But as he moves towards the end of the loneliness, because here he is, he's saying, you know, I'm the only one. I'm the only one that's left. And it was real for him. He was depressed. He was suicidal. He says, Lord, you know, as he sits under that broom tree, he says, I'm ready to die. I've had enough of this. And but God takes him out of that. Firstly, by showing him, listen, you are not the only one. There are 7,000 people that I've reserved for myself. And God had to remind him of that. But then God raises up and Elisha that he needed to walk a journey with. Sort of a mentor-mentee relationship in there, so that he's able to pour into another life, so that that sense of loneliness is taken away.
Wow.
And that's in the restoration. And so, yes, we need those relationships.
Yes.
And especially for pastors that operate within the Lone Ranger type of mentality, and where nothing happens if the pastor is not there in the church, you're going to struggle in ministry.
Sure.
And therefore, you know, we need the community around us. And even though it may be operating virtually, it still can happen. We need the Elijah friendships, and whether it would be at a similar level or at a mentor or mentee level, but we need those relationships so that we are able to combat the sense of loneliness.
But maybe just piggybacking on that, and my mind's just looping to, if you look at the writing of the Apostle Paul, how often he would applaud Timothy or Epaphroditus or Tychicus, who were such valuable partners with him. I think there's a space to turn that around and to say, instead of me being the Paul and who's my Tychicus and my Epaphroditus, who's supporting me and encouraging me, within my network, within my denomination, within the Baptist Union,
Yeah.
maybe I could be the Barnabas or the Epaphroditus
Yeah.
or the Tychicus to somebody else,
Yeah.
and reach out even from a distance. And I think that might be something that we need to consider,
Yeah.
is how can I be an alleviation of loneliness and a support for somebody else?
Okay.
I think I've been concerned about some of the social media explosion over the last couple of months of fighting our little theological battles on various issues. And if that amount of energy was actually channeled into, let me pick up the phone or send a message or an email to be an encouragement to somebody, as Terrel's saying, who's the Lone Ranger out in a limb in Northwest or the Northern Cape or whatever, rather than being at odds with and fighting with the guy's struggling. How do I pray for? How do I support? A phone call costs nothing.
Yeah.
A WhatsApp costs nothing.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's great. Here we have it, pastors. I think what's coming very clear is that we have been thrown to the deep end of the storm. In a just moment, we find ourselves locked into our houses and all by ourselves. But you are not alone. Let's get that message. You are not alone. The Lord has many others, not in the sense that you are together suffering with others. No, there are many others that could actually be of great support. It's a matter of identifying where some of the pastors are. If you have been just walking by yourself, once the rules have been sort of eased, this is the time to build relationships. Maybe we have learned from last year, but if it happens that we go into hard lockdown again, we should not find ourselves wanting. Foster those relationships right now. If they were broken or you were just walking by yourself, gather yourself with some pastors that are close by, whether you are in the rural, whether you are in the suburban city, wherever you are. Just foster some relationships, build them up again, and see to it that you keep those. In case again we go into hard lockdown, you would still be able to communicate together with other pastors. If the fraternal meetings are not yet opened, you could just, possibly the fraternal itself could divide the guys into groups of 2. Just take care of each other. There's lots of things that we can do as pastors just to take care of each other. Gavin, thanks again, and thanks, Terrel. I hope that we can be of great help to each other. We don't know it all, but we have found ourselves in the eye of the storm, and we're going to rock the boat together until we get to the shore. Have a blessed day.